Hey, welcome back. We are continuing our series this week on how can God be good when there's so much evil and suffering in the world. And I'm going to ask you again, if you haven't done it yet, would you take a moment and please leave a rating or a review for this podcast? That's how other people find out about it. That's how they also decide whether it's good or not. And since this audience is younger than most of my adult audience, I can trust that you can figure out how to navigate your phone and leave a rating and review. You wouldn't believe it, but some of us old people have a hard time navigating Apple Podcast and Spotify and figuring out how to do stuff. But you know how to do everything on a phone. So would you take a moment and do that for me, please? Por favor. Thank you. Today we are continuing again the discussion, how can God be good if there's so much evil and suffering in the world? And we talked about how this is a question that's a problem for every worldview. And so even though, and I will admit, I have struggled with this question, I've wrestled with God over this question, I realized that even if I would walk away from my faith, I don't get to walk away from the problem of evil. And it's an issue for every worldview, even the atheistic worldview. And in my opinion, the Christian and biblical response is the one that is the best explanation and gives the most hope and comfort and feels the most true. And I did say feels the most true. I think it is the most true, but I also think it feels the most true. So I don't want you to base your faith on a feeling, but at some point we do have to acknowledge it is faith because we don't yet see God. We talked about how it's a problem for every worldview, how one of the reasons that there's evil and suffering is because God is a God of love and he created us as individuals with a free will, and we have chosen to rebel against that, and our rebellion has consequences. Anytime you choose to do sin, there's a consequence. And so evil is a consequence of rebellion. But how God didn't leave us in that, but he personally entered our suffering in Jesus Christ. You know, most famous Bible verse, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life. God didn't just send a salvation solution, he became the salvation solution and he entered into the sufferings of this world. And that brings me tremendous comfort when I don't understand what God's doing. The fact that he entered into the sufferings of this world helps me tremendously. But let's talk about evil and suffering as well. Why does God allow it? I got to be honest, I don't understand a lot of times why God allows it. I really don't. I feel like maybe not my sin so much, but other people's sin, other people's evil. I wish that God was a little more free and full with the lightning bolts and just stopped things immediately. But I am aware that a lot of times God can be doing something that we don't see in the moment, that we don't understand in the moment. I'm reminded of Genesis chapter 50. It's actually like Genesis 46, 47, 48, 49, and 50. The story of Joseph, where Joseph is the second youngest of 12 brothers. His brothers are jealous of him. You know, dad plays a little bit of favoritism, but Joseph also seems to be touched by God in a way where he has these dreams and visions of what God's going to do in his life. His older brothers, his 10 older brothers, get jealous of him. Initially, they throw him into a pit and are going to kill him. And then they decide, well, we could make some money off of him. So they throw him, or they sell him to some slave traders. The slave traders bring Joseph down to Egypt, and he goes from being a slave in Potiphar's house to a prisoner in the jail of Pharaoh. And in that process, I mean, you're talking years and years and years and years of being a slave and then being in prison. But then ultimately God raises him up out of prison. And it's because he was in prison that he ended up having access to Pharaoh. When Pharaoh has a dream, Joseph is able to interpret Pharaoh's dream, deliver the Egyptians from mass starvation, because there was 7 years of plentiful harvest and then a 7-year famine that happened. And because Joseph understood God's dream and what to do, he was able to advise them to make provision and store up for this famine. And he didn't just save Egypt, he ended up saving his family. Jacob's sons come down to buy grain. Joseph's able to sell it to them. Ultimately, there's the big reveal that Joseph is their brother. And then after Joseph dies, the brothers are terrified that Joseph's going to, after Jacob dies, Joseph's brothers are terrified that Joseph is going to exact revenge on them. And as he's talking to them, Joseph says one of the greatest lines in all of Scripture. He says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. And I love this passage. The brothers literally meant it for evil. Joseph doesn't excuse their behavior. He doesn't gloss over it. He doesn't say, well, like I just misunderstood your intentions. He acknowledges they meant it for evil, but God meant that same evil for good. God did not cause the evil, but God was able to take that evil and turn around and use it for good. And this is just one of those profound principles that we can hold on to in a world of suffering and in a world of evil, that God does not cause evil, but God is so good and he is so powerful and he's so wise that he can take evil and turn it for good. And I think historically we've seen this happen over and over again, where God will take some of the worst things that have happened and he will bring about profound change in it. He will bring about salvation for people in it. He will bring about societal transformation because of the evil that happens. And so if you are experiencing evil right now, I know sometimes it's hard because like as you read the world news, first off, maybe don't, because it's all bad. Even though all bad things aren't happening in the world, what filters down to you is typically the worst of the news. But when you think of your own life and you think of the evil around you, what I want to encourage you is don't lose hope. Don't lose heart. It may be unintentional suffering. Maybe it's a natural disaster. Maybe it's an accident where somebody wasn't looking. Maybe there was some kind of just sickness or something like that. And then there's also true evil. But especially if you are a child of God, you need to understand that God will bring it for good. If you've put your faith in Jesus Christ, Romans 8:28 says, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. So God doesn't cause all things, but God causes all things to work together for good. Ultimately, that good is that we become like Jesus and we get to spend a new heavens and new earth, eternity with God, reigning and ruling over a redemptive creation. But in the meantime, as you see evil, as you experience evil, as those around you experience evil, remember, God can bring good out of evil. And for those who follow him, God will bring good out of evil. And so my encouragement to you is don't lose heart. Keep your eyes focused on Jesus and start asking, God, how are you going to use this horrible thing for good? How can I hand it over to you? And we're going to talk about that a little bit more tomorrow. So we got one more devotion this week. Thanks for hanging in. I know it's a heavy topic, but it's one that you're going to struggle through at some point. So hopefully this gives you some equipment to do that well.